You're listening to the VSL Aviation Podcast, your source for practical aviation knowledge and check ride prep. I'm Seth Lake, professional pilot, DPE, and Director of Operations here at VSL Aviation. Tonight, we're diving into high altitude operations with a focus on oxygen systems and cabin pressurization. We'll talk about the different types of oxygen delivery systems, the FAA requirements, how to calculate oxygen use, best practices for using when maintaining pressurization systems in general aviation aircraft. As always, we'll wrap up with open Q&A, so if you're watching on YouTube, drop your question in the chat, and if you're joining us live on Discord, you'll have a chance to raise your hand and ask your questions live during the Q&A segment. Don't forget to check out our podcast companion thread in Discord for links, references, and a place to keep the discussion going after the show. I'm active there throughout the week, and a trusted CFI team is also available to help you with your questions. Before we jump in, I wanted to introduce my producer, John. He's a CFI, CFII, MEI, fast team representative, and keeps the live stream running, manages the chat, and handles post-production. John, want to say anything before we get started?
Always happy to help out where I can, and even though it doesn't always go according to plan, we do our best, and that's what matters.
Flexibility is the key to air power. Yeah, I appreciate your flexibility and appreciate everyone's patience that have been waiting on here for almost 15 minutes now while we work out the bugs. So before we get started, quick congrats to Connor. He's from the Discord channel, just finished his single engine C commercial add-on down, I think at Jack Brown's down in Florida, so that's pretty cool. And then we had Nolan from the commercial, I think it was commercial initial in a super decathlon. If you want to get a shout out, go to the Discord channel. There's a progress and updates channel, and just drop a note in there and we'll high five you and mention you on next week's show. So, all right, let's get into high altitude operations, oxygen systems and pressurization. So the way I'm a little bit of a change of format, I was kind of talking about on the beginning of the show. If this is your first time on the podcast, you won't notice a difference at all. But if this is something that you've maybe listened to before, hopefully, that's great. We are changing the format just a little bit, and the way I'm doing that is I'm going to pick a topic that is in multiple airman certification standards, or ACS documents. And today I'm talking about high altitude pressurization and oxygen systems. So that's actually in 3 different ACSs. And we're going to talk about not only that area of operation, but kind of dive deep into that system in this case. And some days we might choose a maneuver and dive deep onto that. But instead of doing 3 different random topics, I'm going to try to dive deeper into a specific topic that touches on something that you're going to cover in a check ride. Because a lot of my content is ACS focused, so I figured why not, keep it at that. But I'm always responsive to your feedback, so if you just hate this format, then let me know and we can change it back up to the way it used to be. But this is not like a huge change. So, all right, we're going to go ahead and get started. As with a lot of the stuff I'm sharing the screen here, I'll try to keep it podcast friendly as possible, but remember this is also a video podcast, so you can join us live on Discord, which is a great way. You can also watch on YouTube, or if you got an earbud in and just want to listen while you're working out or driving or whatever, it should work out as well. So what we're going to look at today is the high altitude operations in general, and that encompasses a couple different things. The first place that you're going to be exposed to this is in the commercial check ride. Area of operation, let's see, that's 5, 6, 7, 8. Area of operation 8, high altitude operations. It has 2 tasks, supplemental oxygen and pressurization. So that's task A and B. That'll be the first place in your flying career where you're kind of exposed to, hey, what's a pressurization system, what's an oxygen system or supplemental oxygen, and how to use that. So as with any ACS, there's knowledge topics, there's risk management topics, and then you have to demonstrate proficiency in all the skills. So an examiner like myself might ask 1 knowledge, 1 risk management, and you have to demo all the skills. So in the case of supplemental oxygen, there are 4 skills, but these are a little different because skill 1 says you have to determine the quantity of supplemental oxygen required in a scenario given by the evaluator. So I'll give you a scenario. You have to tell me how much oxygen we need, right? Skill 2 is open or operate or simulate operation of installed or portable oxygen equipment in the airplane, if installed or available. So that's pretty important because it says if installed or available. So most of the time I'm not giving a commercial check ride in an aircraft that has an installed or available oxygen system. So we don't really accomplish skill 2. Skill 3 is brief passengers on use of supplemental oxygen requirements in a scenario given by the evaluator. Again, we're not typically flying that, so that may be a scenario that I just give you, kind of like skill 1 of, hey, if you were in an aircraft. But it doesn't say anything about if installed. It just says that we have to do that. So far we only have 2 skills out of the 4 that we have to do. And then skill 4 is use single pilot resource management or crew resource management as appropriate. So in this case, you would have to use SRM because we're probably doing it in a single pilot aircraft, so you can't use CRM. So this is an odd kind of task. It's kind of the first time that we've seen this in the ACS so far in your training, where it's like, hey, we don't have to do it because it's not installed. There might be a couple other tasks in the private that are like that. I'm thinking of like a ballistic parachute system. You obviously don't need to know how to use that unless it's installed on the aircraft. But those are the 4 that you have to do, and you really only have to do 3 of those skills. So then on to pressurization. This has another 4 skills. Those skills are operate the pressurization system if installed. Okay, so we're probably doing this in a checkride that doesn't have a pressurization system, in an aircraft that doesn't have that, rather. Skill 2 is respond appropriately to simulated pressurization malfunctions if equipment is installed. So again, that's not applicable to us. Brief passengers on use of supplemental oxygen in the case of pressurization malfunction if equipment is installed. Again, doesn't apply to us. And then use single pilot resource management, SRM or CRM as appropriate. So we have to use SRM for pressurization, but then again, the other 3 skills aren't even applicable because we're in an unpressurized aircraft. But we still have to cover 1 knowledge topic and 1 risk management topic of the pressurization system. Now, risk management 2 says if installed. So again, we don't have to cover that one. So there's really only 1 risk management. So that's that equipment if installed statement. If you haven't noticed in the ACS, that's pretty important. If you're in an aircraft that has that installed, you definitely want to know how to use it. If you're in an aircraft that doesn't have it, not that you don't have to worry about it at all, I'd still encourage you to have a working knowledge, but it's not going to be asked on the check ride. Okay, so then we go over to the CFI ACS. So in technical subject area, that's area of operation 2, and task N, which is your high altitude operations supplemental oxygen. And so it talks about supplemental oxygen here. We've got knowledge topics, risk management topics, and then we have 3 skills. So provide adequate briefing on use of supplemental oxygen equipment, operate or simulate operation of installed or portable oxygen equipment in the aircraft if installed or available, and determine the quantity of supplemental oxygen required in a scenario given by the evaluator. So there again, we have to determine quantity. So that's something we're going to talk about today, is how in the world do you do that? Especially if you've probably, like most pilots, you've done all of your training in an aircraft that doesn't even have a portable oxygen system. So you've never done this calculation before. So how are you expected to demonstrate that capability in a check ride, much less as an instructor teach somebody how to do it if you've never done it yourself? So we're going to have to do a little bit of education there. Okay, finally over to the ATP ACS. We actually have, in pre-flight preparation, we have high altitude aerodynamics. That kind of touches on your pressurization and oxygen. It's all related because typically if you're in a pressurized aircraft with an oxygen system, you're also going to be talking about high altitude aerodynamics, and we'll look at an advisory circular that kind of combines all that stuff there. And then it also talks about it in your operation of systems, I believe. I didn't dive into that. Most people that are watching this aren't ATP customers, but believe me, at the ATP level, you'll be expected to know what we're going to talk about today. Okay, so what resources do we have to learn all this? We know that we need to know it, but again, if you're an instructor, you probably never used these systems, and if you're a student, I would say 99.9% of the time, you haven't even seen these systems in an aircraft. But never fear, the FAA does have resources for us. This is a new advisory circular that will actually be added into the next version of the ACE guide. I'm working on version 6.7 right now as we speak. And that's the document that I was just using to tap around all the ACS stuff. We'll go back to that in a moment to see the different systems in there, but this is what I'm going to base off kind of this ground lesson that we're going to do about high altitude flight and cover all this stuff. I think it's a good way to lay it out. It's one of the better written advisory circulars. So this is Advisory Circular 61107 Bravo. The links for this AC are in the podcast companion, so if you want to head over there, if you're watching live, you can open it up and follow along. The reason I like the layout is it has a ground training outline in Chapter 2, and that's the recommendations for high altitude training. So we'll jump to that in just a second, and we're going to go through that line by line on just a basic lesson plan of how I would teach this to a student. And then if you're wanting to kind of self-educate on high altitude stuff because your instructor didn't teach you enough about it, then you can self-educate kind of going through here in Chapter 2. Now, the reason why you might need to operate at high altitude or do ground training here, that's actually outlined here in Part 6131, and that's 6131 is where all those additional endorsements like your tail wheel and your high performance complex and your high altitude endorsement. So the high altitude endorsement, just as a review for everyone, that's only required if you're going to act as pilot in command of a pressurized aircraft, an aircraft that has a service ceiling or maximum operating altitude, whichever is lower, above 25,000 feet MSL. Okay, so you have to have this endorsement if it's a pressurized aircraft that has a service ceiling above 25. So there are a few aircraft, especially general aviation pistons, that maybe don't meet that. They are high performance, they're complex, and they're pressurized, but they may not have a service ceiling above 25,000 feet. So there may be some aircraft out there that you don't technically need a high altitude endorsement to fly, but I really wouldn't recommend, flying any pressurized aircraft without having gone through this training. So this training says you need to have ground training on the following: high altitude aerodynamics and meteorology, respiration, effects and symptoms of hypoxia, duration of consciousness without supplemental oxygen, effects of prolonged usage of supplemental oxygen, causes and effects of gas expansion and gas bubble formation, preventative measures for eliminating gas expansion, gas bubbles formation in high altitude sickness, physical phenomena and incidents of decompression, and any other physiological aspects of high altitude flight. So those are all the things that we need to cover, and what you'll see is this advisory circular that we're going to go through pretty much touches on each one of those in pretty good detail. So we can use that as kind of a lesson plan if we're a CFI, or again, if we're just wanting to self-educate, this is a good place to go to. All right, so we're going to go to page 7 of the advisory circular. That's where we're going to pick it up. So here we go. Here's the training outline. So your ground training, we're going to start with weather, our flight plan and navigation and physiological training, high altitude systems and components, aerodynamics, performance factors, emergencies, and then it gets into our flight training that we're actually going to do. Now, we're just going to talk about the ground training component. This is the basic outline that they started with. I kind of made my own that I'm going to go through as well, because there's some stuff that it doesn't talk about that I wanted to cover, and I'll give you resources for all that, of course, as well. So we're going to breeze through. I'm going to show you the references here, right? But we're going to spend a little less time on some things I'm just going to touch on, and we're going to get to the meat of the subject, which is that pressurization system and supplemental oxygen systems. So that's probably everyone's closest shark to the boat, as it were. You're probably not worried about high altitude aerodynamics really, and you don't need to show proficiency in those high altitude aerodynamics really until the ATP level. So I'm not going to spend as much time talking about that as I am about the supplemental oxygen. And one of the other resources that you're going to see in the show notes or the Discord channel is the oxygen equipment brochure from the FAA. We're also going to be referencing this, and this is oxygen equipment use in general aviation operations. This is another, it's not like an in-depth resource, but it is a decent resource, and there's some stuff in there that we're going to talk about. So back to the advisory circular. I'll pull up a couple things here. I've got some notes that I'm going to go through. So for our high altitude flight environment, our flight characteristics and operation considerations above 18,000 feet. So this is looking at our weather. We're used to looking at the surface analysis charts, stuff below 18,000 feet. So just realize that your atmosphere composition above 18,000 feet is a little bit different than what you're used to dealing with, kind of the weather patterns, and especially altitude winds and temperatures, a little bit different than the lower altitude stuff. So most weather charts, they'll have a low, a mid, and a high chart to look at. And those ranges are defined on each of those charts, but typically the high charts are what you're going to be looking at, anything above 20,000 feet. That's when you start getting closer to that jet stream. So your winds and wind shear, that plays a big role in commercial aviation or any type of swept wing aviation where you're in the flight levels above 30,000 feet. So maybe you make a pit stop on your way to the airlines if that's your career that you're going into. You might do some turboprop flying. I did a lot of turboprop flying myself earlier in my career. We spent a lot of time in the 20,000 feet kind of flight regime and below. The 18 to 20,000, 18 to 28,000 in there outside of your RBSM airspace, that's pretty much the same weather that you're dealing with down at 10,000 feet or 8,000 feet. It's not that much different. We're not flying over any storms there. We're dealing with the bases of those thunderstorms, because remember, these big convective activity, they're extending all the way up to 70,000 feet. We're also maybe getting a little bit better winds or worse winds, depending on how you look at it. So we might get a higher tailwind, but we'll also get a higher headwind. And there'll be times where it drives us down to a lower altitude anyway. So not a huge change in the weather patterns in kind of the 20,000 feet and below. Once you get up to 30,000 feet and above, that's when the weather starts to change significantly. You start to see really big winds and wind shear, and more importantly probably is your clear air turbulence. That's a phenomenon that really, I haven't seen it happen in the lower altitudes as much. We might call it kind of turbulent air, but I think that's just a little unstable air on convection. You're flying around and it's a little bumpy, and hey, the air's clear. Is that clear air turbulence? Not really. We're talking about high level turbulence, and it's maybe a little more aggressive than just some bumps that you're feeling while you're out there doing steep turns in your 172 at 3,000 feet on a summer day, right? That's just bumpy air. I wouldn't really define that as clear air turbulence. So it defines it here as clear air turbulence as a meteorological phenomenon associated with high altitude winds. And this high level turbulence occurs where no clouds are present and can take place at any altitude, normally higher than 15,000 feet above ground level. So that clear air turbulence is not what you've experienced in your 172. It's something that's maybe a little more aggressive, and we'll actually talk about how that affects our load factor and where we're flying a swept wing jet. Kind of ties into high altitude aerodynamics and the amount of buffer that we want to have from our buffet speeds, which we'll talk about later here in this lesson. Next, we have clouds and thunderstorms. So cirrus and cumuliform clouds are high altitude clouds composed of ice crystals. And then it goes on to talk about these different clouds. This is actually the high altitude is where you'll start to see the ice crystals kind of crystallize, where you get at a temperature below, typically it's about negative 40 degrees, where you no longer are really worried about icing conditions, right? There are ice crystals, but they're so, developed as crystals there, they're not going to stick to your aircraft. So they're just going to bounce right off. So typically we're not as concerned about airframe icing at those high altitudes, but we are concerned about some phenomenon like ice crystal icing. And again, that's kind of more of an ATP thing to be worried about. And then icing at high altitudes, again, it's not as common there. That's the last paragraph it talks about. Okay, now into flight planning. Your operational considerations, let's see, get down here. So planning for high altitude routes, fuel, oxygen requirements. So the routes are going to be the same. You might be using a high altitude en route chart instead of a low altitude en route chart, but functionally it operates the same. If you know how to use a low altitude chart, high altitude chart's very similar. Just make sure you're using the correct one. That does cause some confusion, I found, where if you accidentally select that in an application like ForeFlight, you could be planning, or usually it's the reverse. Maybe it's somebody's first King Air flight, and I'm bringing them along, and we're up at 25,000 feet, and I'm flying to a point, or ATC lists a point, and they can't find it on ForeFlight. Well, you have to go into ForeFlight and tell ForeFlight that you're using high altitude waypoints, and you're going to see different waypoint names than the waypoints at low altitudes. So just make sure you have that selected. So that's our altitude considerations. My favorite one here for planning is your descent planning. Descent planning becomes a really big deal when you're at a significant altitude. And I've noticed that it's really a knowledge gap that exists in general aviation is when you're learning how to fly in like a Piper or a Cessna, you typically don't get higher than 8,000 feet on most of your check rides, or most of your, definitely your check rides, but most of your cross countries. And so what that leads to is, since you're always at a relatively low altitude, the descent planning really isn't that hard. You see the airport, you pull the power, you descend, you land, not a big deal. Well, in all cases, when you're flying a swept wing jet or flying in the flight levels, you're gonna have to begin your descent to your airport before you can even see your airport. You know, you might not even be the same state as your airport, and you're going to need to start your descent planning. So this is gonna start around 80 to 100 miles out, often even further, and it's all related to your ground speed and your altitude. So again, that's ATP level knowledge that you're gonna have to develop, but this does touch on it here. Okay, so that's our flight planning. The thing that we are gonna have to talk about here is the use of oxygen on our flight. And this is where we start getting into the nitty-gritty of flying, maybe the first type of oxygen system that you're going to use as a general aviation pilot. And that's using some sort of supplemental oxygen system. It might be portable, it might be installed, but typically it's gonna be compressed oxygen. And you're gonna have to figure out, well, how much do I have on board? How much do I need? And do I have enough for the planned flight at the altitude that I'm going to? Right, and that's where we get back to that the Airman Certification Standards for Commercial Pilot, where it said, hey, you're going to have to demonstrate proficiency in being able to determine the appropriate amount of oxygen for the flight that you're doing. So this gets into physiological training here, but let's pause that for a second and talk about how do we calculate how much oxygen that we need. And for that, we're going to go over to this oxygen equipment brochure from the FAA that I have linked here, and it'll be in the show notes for those of y'all watching at a later date. Generally speaking, these brochures are pretty good. They give just a working knowledge, and I think they're really good resources to use when you're prepping for a check ride, because as an examiner, I don't expect you to have more in-depth knowledge than what this brochure is going over. You know, if you have that, it's a really good study aid, basically. Okay, and then if you're an aircraft owner, if you're flying an aircraft that has an oxygen system, it's great to review with a CFI as you're getting your high altitude endorsement. Okay, so it has some general precautions here, and it has the basic components. So let's talk about the different storage systems that we have here. We've got a gaseous aviator's breathing oxygen, or ABO. So this is our oxygen as a gas, and this is the most common one, and it's gonna be a bottle with compressed oxygen, and it's going to be aviator's oxygen here. And it can be high pressure vessels like 1800 to 2200 psi, or it can be low pressure. There's different, models of these, and they come in many different sizes. Some of them really small, some of them are really big and permanently installed in the aircraft kind of. Some of them you can just put in a bag and put in the back seat and run a hose up to your cannulas to use that oxygen system. But this is by far the most common one. Next, we have liquid aviators breathing oxygen, or LOX. LOX it's probably the opposite of the compressed gas oxygen systems. LOX is probably the least common way that we have oxygen stored on the aircraft, especially in general aviation aircraft. So I don't think you're going to run into LOX except at the transport category aircraft. And then we have sodium chlorate candles. That's right, oxygen candles, which is kind of a funny term because typically you don't want pure oxygen and flame. So to have those two together, it's kind of interesting, but it does work. And these are actually, when you're in a commercial aircraft in the back and the masks drop out, those are typical to be oxygen candles. So they're actually expending a lot of heat. They heat up to about 350 degrees, and they thermally decompose and release oxygen as a byproduct, and that's what you're breathing in as a passenger at the back there. So when those masks drop out of the ceiling and you tug on the hose, you're pulling the pin on a grenade basically, and it lights this candle off and it starts heating up. You can imagine on a big aircraft, those overhead bins, let's say you've got 175 of those overhead, 175 of those oxygen masks, and those candles are all cooking off at 350 degrees each, it creates a lot of heat. And it can actually, the dust and stuff that gets on those candles will start to bake off, and you might smell a weird odor. You might get some fumes or something. And it's already, if you're having to use that in a decompression situation, it's already a stressful event, so that can cause even more confusion. So it's just something to think about. There are some sodium chlorate candle solutions for general aviation, but they're emergency oxygen generators. They're not primary like we're going to be talking about. We're primarily going to be talking about the compressed gas option that was the first one. And then probably the second least uncommon one that you might run into in the military, if you're a military aviator, is the MSOG, and that's the molecular sieve oxygen generators. So it's basically taking the ambient air, separating the oxygen out of it, and which is, it's 21% or so of our air is oxygen. So it takes it, separates the air, gets the pure oxygen, and sends it back to us as 100% oxygen. Typically these are called like OBOG systems. Again, not very common in general aviation, so we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about them. Our oxygen delivery system. So now we're going to assume that we have some sort of compressed gas there, right? We've got a green bottle filled with gas, or filled with oxygen, right? And it's the aviator's oxygen. We don't want medical grade oxygen, because medical grade oxygen isn't the same standard. It could have moisture in it. So the aviator's oxygen is going to make sure it doesn't have moisture in it. And the reason we don't want moisture in it is because we're operating this oxygen system at a high altitude. So there's an instance in the King Air, there's an example in the King Air where your oxygen handle on older King Airs is up on top of the cabin here, right? And the oxygen bottle is all the way in the tail. So the oxygen has to travel from the tail all the way up through the cabin, which the top of the cabin is not that thick, so it's right at the skin of the aircraft, and runs all the way up to the pilots. And there's a T-handle you pull to engage that oxygen system. Now the King Air is pressurized, so most of the time you don't need oxygen, right? Because the cabin's pressurized to generally about a 7,000, 8,000 foot atmosphere when you're cruising. So you don't need supplemental oxygen, but you need to have it as an emergency backup, right? So if we have a rapid decompression, you need to be able to activate that system. Well, there's instances where they had either the incorrect oxygen in the plane, or the aviation grade wasn't completely up to snuff, and there's some other ways this could happen too. But they basically had moisture in the system. So the oxygen that was in that line running all the way up through the top of the cabin got cold soaked, and it had water in it, and that water froze. So when the pilots had a decompression event and they had to turn on the oxygen system, they couldn't pull the T-handle because it was frozen shut. So that's just a real world example of why we want to use aviator's oxygen that doesn't have that water in it. Anyway, back to our oxygen delivery systems. We have a diluter demand, a pressure demand, and then we also have just continuous flow. So the diluter demand and the pressure demand, those are systems that you're typically going to see in pressurized aircraft, and they're going to be some sort of emergency backup in the case of a depressurization event. The reason we need this is actually a physiological reason, and we'll go back and talk about in 61-107 why we need that. But just to cover it here, at higher altitudes, we have a lower partial pressure of oxygen. So the oxygen down here is kind of being pressurized into our lungs. I know you don't feel like it's being pressurized, but we're at the bottom of this great big atmosphere. And so it's kind of forcing the air, the oxygen molecules into our lungs. And at higher altitudes, it's not that there's less oxygen. There's the same proportional amount at altitude as there is down here. It's that there's less pressure. So it's not getting pushed into our lungs like it is down here. So up at 12,000 feet, for instance, in order to get the same percentage of oxygen into our blood, we need to be breathing in a higher percentage of oxygen. But even, let's say you have those little nose cannulas in that are giving you 100% oxygen, above 18,000 feet, they're really not doing you that much good, because the oxygen is getting into your lungs, but it's not getting into your bloodstream because there's no pressure behind it. So at high altitudes, we need some sort of full face mask That's required above 18,000 feet. And then at higher altitudes, so let's say you have a rapid decompression up at 30,000 feet. So suddenly the cabin altitude goes from 8,000 to 30,000 feet, rapid decompression. If you had nose cannulas on, you would still pass out. That's not going to help you. So you need a full face mask that's going to send air through your nose and your mouth and pressurize it into your lungs. And that's also what the pressure demand system does. At really high altitudes, you're going to have a higher pressure pushing that into your lungs. So up at like 40 or 50,000 feet, you would have to have, it's almost, and I've done this in the Air Force, it's like having your lungs inflated. It's uncomfortable, it's difficult to talk because it's just forcing air into your lungs with that pressure. So again, these are very uncommon to see this in a small GA aircraft, but what is very common is what we're going to talk about next, and those are continuous flow systems, and typically you'll see two. You'll see the nasal cannula, and you'll see the full face mask. So the oral nasal rebreather, and that's just a mask that goes over your mouth and your nose. Now these aren't sending pressurized air into your lungs, and specifically the nose cannula, they're just providing you with a source of 100% oxygen. There's no pressure behind it. And FAA regulations, these are actually in Part 23 and Part 25. I think there's Part 23 for the nose cannula. But anyway, it can't be used above 18,000 feet. So if you are flying a GA aircraft with like a installed oxygen system and you're above 18,000 feet, you need to have a mask that's covering your nose and your mouth, not just the nasal cannulas. So these are just sending oxygen at a continuous flow. And what I've got here is an example of the Your SkyOx portable oxygen system. They're not a sponsor or anything. I just found their stuff online a little bit easier. So this is hopefully familiar. Maybe you've seen one of these around an airplane that you've seen at the local FBO. Some FBOs even sell this sort of stuff. But this is called SkyOx. And at the beginning of here, it actually talks about our altitude gauge settings. So what you'll have is something that looks like this. This is your flow indicator, and this is your little regulator. And so your flow indicator and regulator, you're going to turn that to this table. And what I'm looking here for the audio listeners only is that you have a liters per minute setting for a specific altitude. So we're going to look at the 15,000 feet. So up to 15,000 feet, the manufacturer here is saying that you need 0.5 liters per minute, okay? So 0.5 liters per minute at 15,000 feet. And then if we scroll down to the very bottom of this page, or the very bottom of their guide here, it talks about the volume content for, let's say, the model number, this SK12-9, which is a model number. So we can look up the SK12-9 and see that it's a 9 cubic feet aluminum cylinder. Okay, and it gives us the dimensions. It weighs 7 pounds. So that's kind of giving you an idea of how big this bottle is. And it gives us 248 liters. Okay, so now we have the basic information of what we need to calculate for flight planning purposes. Do we have enough oxygen on board? And so this top table here, it gives us using a cannula, hours of operation at 15,000 feet. It says we have 8 hours, basically 8 hours, 7 minutes, if that cylinder is completely full. And that works out to be 248 liters. So it makes the math easy. You just read it there. It says 8 hours, but that's also just when it's completely full. And then we can go up here and see that the math works out. If you want to do the math there at home, it's 0.5 liters per minute. So you just multiply that by 60 to come in your liters per hour, and take 248 and divide it by that number. You're going to come up with about 8 hours. So that's the basic math that you're doing for your flight planning for these continuous flow systems that you're typically going to see in general aviation aircraft. So that finishes off our mission planning. So we've got 8 hours if that cylinder is completely full. We'll talk about some of the things with servicing these systems and some challenges that you might face if it's not completely full. And then we have to basically do some rough estimates on, hey, do we have enough oxygen? Because remember, that's that's per person, right? That's just for one person. So if you've got 4 people on the flight, you've got to take the number, the 0.5 liters per minute, multiply that 60, come up by your liters per hour, or minutes if it's that short of a flight, and multiply that by the number of people you have on board if you're all using the same tank, right? And some of these systems might have multiple tanks, but we'll just assume one there when you're doing your math. But that's the basic math formula. You're going to come up with the liters per minute that the manufacturer says. You're going to be able to set that on your regulator on any of these aviation systems and come up with your flight planning information. Okay, so let's make sure I covered that. That's our planning for high altitude oxygen requirements. Okay, now let's move on to human physiology at altitude. So we've already talked a little bit about the physics of the atmosphere, where we're talking about the partial pressure of oxygen, right? This advisory circular has a really good breakdown of all the gas laws and their effects on the human body. Now remember, if we go back to what's required, in fact, I've got it pulled up here. In 6131, like we talked about before, 6131G, and that's your high altitude endorsement training, it spent, there's a couple lines here: causes and effects of gas expansion and gas bubble formation and preventative measures for eliminating gas. Those are all things that we need to talk about. And that's what this table here, this section starting on page 12, is talking about in the advisory circular, is your different gas laws, their aviation applications, so your trapped gas, your hypoxia, your decompression sickness. All of that is talked about in this table here. So it's actually a good way to set up a ground lesson and study all of these specific phenomenon that you need to know. So let's talk about the partial pressure of oxygen, because I've already touched on that kind of anecdotally. So here's where I'd go for the source data here. Partial pressure of oxygen is approximately 20% of the total atmosphere, where we talked about that. It's 21%. So here's where it gets into the millimeters of mercury or pressure. So at sea level, that's about 152 millimeters of mercury or pressure. And that's 20% of the total atmosphere of 100 or 760. So your total atmosphere 760, 20% of that is 152. But then you go up to 12,000 feet, and if you account for the amount of carbon dioxide diffusion in the blood, and you account for the water vapor that's in your lungs, because that's taking up some space, basically that's where we get to where, okay, just at 12,000 feet, we're going to see a drop from around 98% down to about 85%. So that partial pressure already at 12,000 feet is affecting us. And in fact, this AC talks about how even at 10,000 feet, we can already see the effects. And it's kind of interesting to hear all the applicants, you memorize all the oxygen level rules for the 12,500 and the time, all that stuff. It's interesting that Part 91 allows for that. Meanwhile, in Part 135, Part 121, and the military, 10,000 feet is generally the hard rule. Like, you have to have supplemental oxygen above 10,000 feet. So I would really caution you, if you're planning on doing a flight above 10,000 feet without the use of supplemental oxygen, I would caution you against that. The 12,500, 12,000 foot range, that's, it's not required below 12.5, but man, I really wouldn't recommend it. And this section here of the advisory circular even says that. It says, although oxygen is not required below 12,500 MSL when operating in accordance with Part 91, we recommend its use when flying unpressurized aircraft above 10,000 MSL during the day and above 5,000 MSL at night, when the eyes become more sensitive to oxygen deprivation. So that's a really interesting statement, right? And that would be one of the things that I would love to hear during a check ride when we get to that section as a commercial pilot, saying, well, I know all the legal requirements, but it's kind of like personal minimums. I know what the legal requirements are for my visibility and cloud clearance and all that, but as a safe pilot, here's my personal minimums and what I'm actually going to do. So knowing what the hard rules are for oxygen is great, but the recommendation is anything above 10,000, you should have that. I'll be honest, I've flown unpressurized aircraft at night above 5,000 without supplemental oxygen. Me personally, I haven't had any issues there, but I do not fly above 10,000 feet without supplemental oxygen. I actually tried one day, we were in a twin, I had my family with me, wife in the back seat, wife in the right seat, 2 kids in the back seat. And there was a little bit of weather. And I was on an instrument flight plan, but I just didn't want to fly through this weather. We were up at, I think, 9,000 feet. And I asked for 11,000 feet for the next 10 miles, just so I could get over this weather, because we were, again, right there at the edge. ATC gave it to me because nobody's down there. So, of course, they're like, yeah, clear to climb to 11,000 feet. So I went full power, climbed up to 11,000 feet. Not 2 minutes after being at 11,000 feet, my wife taps me on the shoulder and says she's got a splitting headache. And it's getting worse by the second. And my daughter hears her over the intercom, and she says the same thing, that she's just not feeling very well at all. And that, we might need to land early because I'm just not feeling well. And I'm like, I think it's because of the altitude. So I immediately went back to ATC, said, hey, 11,000 is not working out, request back down to, I think I went down to 7,000. We had terrain clearance, and I wanted to get down to where there was more oxygen. And sure enough, as soon as we got down to 7,000 feet, we leveled off about 5 minutes later, checked on them, totally fine. So that's just a real world example of where I've seen the physiological effects of flying above 10,000 feet without oxygen. It can have a rapid effect on you. Okay, then this goes into talking about trapped gas. Trapped gases are really important when it comes to your sinuses. Man, I don't know how many times I've heard pilots flying sick. And if you go up with a head cold, the climb is going to be probably fine, right? You're going to be able to climb up to altitude, and it might be a little uncomfortable, but it's not going to be that bad. Now, when you start to try to descend, man, the descent will literally bring you to your knees. Like, it will make you just break down in pain. It is incredibly, incredibly painful. So this is my warning for you right now. If you're sick, don't go out and go fly. If you've got a little bit of head congestion and you do decide to fly, try not to get above 3,000 feet. Like, you can go up and do some pattern work, that's fine, maybe. But man, I would highly, highly recommend that you make sure your sinuses are completely clear before you go fly. And if you're going to go fly a pressurized or high performance aircraft that's flying at the flight levels, definitely don't fly with a head cold. Just don't do it. And this section here, starting on page 16 of this advisory circular, gives a good breakdown of all the places that you might have trapped gases and how those could affect your physiology during flight. All right, so going back, a little break here. Matt on Discord says, also worth mentioning, altitude acclimation is also going to play a role in how well someone does at higher altitudes, and you're absolutely right there. If someone lives at 6,000 feet, they're going to have less of an issue if they have lived at or below sea level. Yeah, you're right. So if you're from out like Albuquerque or Denver, you're just naturally going to be more acclimated, and that's why you can see, like those climbers at Mount Everest, like the monks and stuff that live around there. I forget what the Sherpas, they climb up the mountain without any supplemental oxygen somehow because their body's accumulated to it. And I imagine it has something to do with the hemoglobin, like the physiological thing that's happening, is they just have more blood to carry the oxygen, so they're getting more oxygen. They're still getting the same pressure, the same partial pressure, but they must just have more blood in their bloodstream there. So next we're getting into more physiological problems with increased altitudes. So we have hyperventilation. So hyperventilation is defined as the increase in the rate and depth of breathing that exchanges gas in the lungs in the lung beyond the volume necessary to maintain normal levels of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Hyperventilation will result in disturbances in the acid balance of the blood and eventually the brain. As levels of carbon dioxide in the lungs fall, the sign and symptoms of hyperventilation, it's basically a problem with carbon dioxide and not oxygen. All right, next we have hypoxia. So hypoxia is the state of oxygen deficiency in the blood. We all know, or should know, what hypoxia is because you study this at the private pilot level. So your typical hypoxic altitude hypoxia, that's any condition that interrupts the flow to O2, or the flow of oxygen to the lungs. So the This type of hypoxia is encountered at high altitudes, or at altitude, due to the reduction of partial pressure of oxygen. So that's what we've been talking about. Hypoxic hypoxia, that's what you're worried about. And like I said, and like this advisory circular said, that actually starts as soon as you start to climb, really, but you start to feel the effects of it. I would say around 7,000 feet, you can start to noticeably see a decrease in your blood oxygen levels. And definitely above 10,000 feet, you'll start to see those dive off. So we'll talk about this here in a second, of ways that you can monitor this. So the different types of hypoxia, we got the hypemic hypoxia, the stagnant hypoxia, and the hystoxic hypoxia there. Won't go into all those because we're mainly concerned about that first one, hypoxic hypoxia. All right, so it has a warning here. If hypoxia is suspected, immediately don oxygen mask, breathe 100% oxygen slowly, and descend to a safe altitude. If supplemental oxygen is not available, initiate an emergency descent to an altitude below 10,000 feet. If symptoms persist, land as soon as possible. So CFIs out there, this is a great reason to practice an emergency descent at the private pilot level. So set up a scenario where you're flying along at 13,000 feet, and maybe you bring along a blood oxygen monitor, and you start to feel, tell your student, hey, in this scenario, you start to feel lightheaded. You monitor your blood oxygen level and see that it's, at 80% and dropping. What do? You're at 13,000 feet. Well, hey, I'm going to go into an emergency descent. I'm going to declare a mayday, say, hey, I'm descending out of 13,000, clear the air below me and power idle, dive down. I want to get to higher levels of pressure as soon as possible so I can recover from that hypoxia event. I've talked about it on the show before. I don't love the emergency descent for engine fires or stuff, because typically during an engine fire, we're just going to maintain altitude and remove the source of the fuel. We're not going to go diving at the ground right away. So really a reasonable case to do an emergency descent is in a rapid decompression, which we'll get into later. But if you're flying a pressurized aircraft and you're up at 30,000 feet and you experience a cabin altitude that increases to 30,000 feet, you really only have a few minutes to get down to altitude, especially if you have passengers that don't get on emergency oxygen right away. If you stay up at 30,000 feet too long, you're going to start killing people in the back, right? In a short order, they're going to pass out first, then brain damage is going to occur, and then death is going to occur. If you don't get your oxygen on, then everybody's out of luck, right? Because you are going to go through the same thing. You're going to lose consciousness, brain damage, and then death. And unfortunately, we've seen this happen on a number of occasions in high performance, generally like private jet single pilot operations, where the pilot is incapacitated because of a rapid decompression and the plane crashes. All right, this talks about how, being a heavy smoker, not being in good shape, I guess, that could also have negative effects on this. Nothing too surprising there. Gives you a few warnings there. I'm going to try to speed things up to get to some of the things I wanted to talk about here. All right. The hypoxia signs and symptoms. So the signs: rapid breathing, cyanosis. I know I'm saying that wrong. I should have practiced it. But basically the bluing effect. You see the lips start to turn blue or purple a little bit. That's a indication of that. Poor coordination, lethargy, executing poor judgment. That's mine. I've actually been hypoxic before. I kind of shared an example a couple of episodes ago, I think, where we had a pressure problem in the C-130 repressurizing, and we didn't have masks on. We were above 10,000 feet. We were at 15,000 feet, I think is the highest that we got. But we weren't there for very long. So this started at around 12,000 feet. And I was like, oh, everything's fine. I'm not worried about anything. So obviously having some poor judgment, because we were in a critical situation, and the hypoxia was causing me to just like, oh no, we're good. And that tends to be my symptoms when I'm in the altitude chamber. Sweating, trembling, and muscle spasms. So your symptoms: air hunger, fatigue, nausea, headache, dizziness, hot, cold flashes. Those are all listed there. All right, preventative measures against hypoxia. So a common technique for aviators is to monitor themselves for hypoxia using a finger pulse oximeter. So that's the little device that you can put on the tip of your finger. Probably had it at a doctor's office, and it'll tell you in a percent, like should be 100%, what your blood oxygen level is. I wear a smartwatch. Samsung, if you wear Apple, they do the similar function, and they're just measuring it from your wrist. And I find it to be pretty close to the finger ones, so those are good. One thing that I'll say, and it does caution you against here, is the FAA cautions against the use of relying on pulse oximeters as the sole indicator of hypoxia, because waiting for the percent oxygen saturation levels reported by the pulse ox to fall before taking action might result in hypoxia sufficient to cause impairment, right? So if your symptom is like mine, by the time you look down and see that your pulse ox is low, you might already be in a situation where you're making bad decisions and you don't execute that descent down. So be careful on there. Also, pulse oximeters will, I learned this from Max Trescott's show, but he found that the pulse oximeters aren't really measuring oxygen, they're just looking at your hemoglobin, kind of your infrared signature of your hemoglobin when it has an oxygen molecule on it. Well, something that also binds to hemoglobin even better than oxygen is carbon monoxide. So if you're getting poisoned by carbon monoxide, let's say you have a heater going, that pulse oximeter is actually going to start to increase. So you'll start to see, hey, my pulse ox is 100%. I must be in great shape. So if you are used to seeing like the low 90s when you're at altitude, and all of a sudden you see 100%, that might be an early indication that you're getting some sort of carbon monoxide poisoning. So I'd investigate that further. Just thought I'd throw that in there because it's kind of interesting. All right. So here we go. Time of useful consciousness. So this is something that was mentioned in a couple of the different airman certification standards. And we have the table here of our time of useful consciousness. So at 18,000 feet, our TUC is 20 to 30 minutes, and a rapid decompression is only 10 to 15. So if we've slowly gotten up there unpressurized, we have a little bit longer than if that rapid decompression has taken over. It talks about why a rapid decompression versus a slow decompression affect us differently. Now, in my experience, I don't know if I buy that for everybody. Maybe best case 20 to 30 minutes, but man, at 18,000 feet, it depends on what you define useful consciousness as. But I know for me, I would not trust myself at 18,000 feet unpressurized. All right, then you look at 50,000 feet, you have 9 to 12 seconds. Again, that's not a lot of time, and what we found, I believe it talks about in the AC here, is that it usually takes about, on average, I think they figure 13 to 17 seconds to recognize and react and get the oxygen mask on. And typically that's going to be somewhere in the ballpark of like 15 seconds. So if you see where most of the commercial airliners are, it's 15 to 20 seconds of time of useful consciousness with a slow decompression, and it says nominal following a rapid D. So if you're at 40,000 feet and have a rapid D, you almost have no time. And at 35,000 feet, at least you have 15 to 30 seconds. You do have a little bit of time to get that mask on. But the altitudes you're talking about in general aviation, you've got some minutes, let's say, but it's definitely nothing to play around with. All right, and it talks about the effects or the different factors in time of use of consciousness. All right, types of evolved gas decompression sickness. Again, not going to talk a ton about this, but there is a table that talks about it. They're talking about the stuff like the bends and the fact that you should probably not go flying after you've been scuba diving, right? We've probably all studied that in the Aeronautical Information Manual. Just make sure you're reading that correctly, where it's scuba diving that requires a timed ascent, and that's the restriction there, and 8,000 feet. So those are a couple of the numbers that are floating out there in the aim for decompression sickness, especially for you scuba divers that are out there. But you can also have it if you're in a high performance aircraft flying at the higher flight levels and have a decompression event. The O2 brochure we were talking about earlier, so we kind of skipped ahead here, but we talked about the systems, we talked about their effects on flight planning. Now let's look at the price check. So I wasn't really familiar with this one until I looked at this brochure, but it's actually a pretty good check. So the price check is your pressure, regulator, indicator, connections, and emergency. So it's just a mnemonic for you to remember what to check in these oxygen systems. So if you're flying with some sort of supplemental oxygen system, the price check is a good way that you want to check your system. So let's go through these line by line. Your pressure, you want to look at the oxygen bottle to make sure you have enough pressure to complete the flight. Now here's where the type of system that you have on board really matters, because if it's an aircraft supplement, so if it's aircraft equipment it's permanently installed, it's going to have some sort of supplement that will say, normally what I've seen is, let's say 1500 psi equates to X number of liters. And there you have your liters. You do your liters per minute, find your liters per hour, and then multiply that by the number of people that you have on board the aircraft at the altitude that you're flying at. And then you come up with how many liters that you need to have on board. So that's the pressure check. The regulator, you want to inspect each regulator to make sure it works. So in this case, on the ground, you would activate the oxygen system and make sure the regulator is actually regulating. Make sure that it's not stuck, right? I've seen these systems in older aircraft that the owners don't ever use. And then we have a new owner, and so the previous owner never used it. It's been shoved in the back seat of the backrest of the plane. So I pull out this ancient nose cannula, and it has a regulator and a real simple connector that shows the flow indicator. And sure enough, I turn the system on and everything's jammed and it doesn't work. So this is stuff that you need to pre-flight. All right, your indicator. Most oxygen delivery systems have some sort of indicator that have the indication of oxygen flow. You want to make sure that those operate correctly. So if you're using a nose cannula, it's going to be continuous flow. It should go from red to green, something like that, to show you that the oxygen is actually flowing. If that's not opening up, then you don't know that you're getting oxygen, and that's the worst, right? Is you have these nose cannulas on, the oxygen system activated, you think you're getting oxygen and you're actually not. That could be really disastrous, right? All right, next we have our connections. Make sure that all your connections are secure and that you don't have any leaks in the line, right? This could be a flight planning problem, right? If you have a leak in the line and you think you're doing 0.5 liters per minute and there's a leak just blowing air out of the hose prior to getting to your face, now you're using more oxygen than you thought you were. You may not have enough to do the flight. Or it may not be getting to the actual nose cannula. It may be leaking out through one of those connections. And then emergency, have oxygen equipment in the aircraft ready to use for emergencies that require oxygen. So hypoxia, smoke and fumes, rapid decompression, decompression sickness. And then this step should include briefing the passengers on the location of the oxygen proper use. So I've run into this actually with a Baron that I fly for a family, and they're not aviators. So I have to brief them, if we're gonna use oxygen, hey, this is how you put the nose cannulas on. Let me set your demand to the proper flow setting for the altitude we'll be using today. I talked to them a little bit about hypoxia symptoms. If they see it, hey, notify me and I'll just request a lower altitude, because really we're only flying up there for convenience. We don't have to be up there, right? If the oxygen isn't working or they're uncomfortable, we can always descend. So Tyler, Aviator 99, on my second flight lesson for private pilot, was going to be absolutely beautiful sunset, had a really bad cold with sinus congestion, really wanted to go flying. I was basically begging my CFI, he didn't budge. I wasn't aware why we couldn't, so I was happy we did ground instead, but now I'm thankful he didn't budge. Yeah, Tyler, if you had gone flying, I've known a couple of people that were basically off flying status in the Air Force for over a year because they tried to tough it out and go fly sick. And they got up to altitude fine, but on the descent down, actually blew out their sinuses. They had blood coming out of their ears and nose when they landed, and it tore up their sinuses so bad they couldn't fly for a full year. So definitely don't budge on that. Winston in Discord, since I've started waiting to build those night XC hours, I always keep my pulse oximeter with me now. That's good. Matt is telling me how to pronounce cyanosis. Cyanosis. I still don't know how, sorry. Flightologist, I just bought one of these and the continuous monitor and have audio alerts through the iPad. So looks like it's some sort of wearable, I guess, pulse oximeter. That's pretty cool to alert you through. One pulse oximeter that I've been impressed by I haven't used it directly, but I think Cirrus has one that it's installed on the aircraft and you have to use it like every 10 minutes. And if you miss one of those 10 minutes, it'll give you an audio alert. And if you still don't do anything, it'll automatically descend down to 10,000 feet. So I think that might just be on like the Vision Jet, but that's pretty cool. But that's a pretty cool thing that you can, kind of a wearable. That's neat. Okay, so Tyler 99 on Discord. So what are good ways to measure your oxygen to know you're becoming hypoxic for people that can't right now get a hypoxic chamber? Yeah, so I think, like, how do you know what your symptoms are? We'll talk about that in a little bit. Matt talked about that. So Jaeger, so in pressurized aircraft, you only need to calculate for 10 minutes of oxygen per occupant to be legal. It depends, Jaeger, it depends. And then Drew Laughinghouse says Oklahoma City Prot. Yeah, Drew Laughinghouse is a good friend of mine. And we flew up to the Oklahoma City and did the Prot chamber. So you can go up there for free through Cami. And I'll try to drop a link in Discord about that. Back to our pamphlet here. Our pamphlet ends with Part 91 General Flight Rules and Part 135 Requirements. So you can kind of look at those. Those aren't up to date, so I would look at the current versions, but it'll at least get you in the right ballpark of where to look in Part 91. So Part 91 211 for supplemental oxygen and Part 135 89 for pilot's use of that. Okay, so we talked about the price check. One thing that I'll go back to on the AirOx system here is your maintenance that you have on these systems. So let's say you're flying an aircraft and it has an oxygen system. We've talked about the calculation, the liters per minute, converting that to hours. We talked about the regulator, the price check, right? Now let's talk about the cylinder maintenance. So the first thing that we're going to have to maintain is if we use the system, we're going to have to refill the system. So this is where kind of an interesting thermodynamic law comes into play. And that's when we increase the pressure of a gas, we're going to increase the temperature. So if you go and you take your compressed gas cylinder and you compress it from 500 psi or 100 psi all the way up to 2200 psi at one go, you're going to cause a lot of buildup of heat. That cylinder is going to get very hot. So it depends on the cylinder manufacturer and the rules here, but you definitely want to use the flight supplement or whatever the manufacturer suggests. In this case, they want you to fill up the cylinder in stages. So each stage should take no less than 3 minutes to accomplish, with a 2-minute rest in between each stage. So we're going to fill it to 500 psi and then hack the clock for 3 minutes. And then we're going to take 2 minutes. Then we're going to fill it from 500 to 1000 psi and another 2 minutes. Again, you don't want to refill the cylinder too fast because it's going to heat up a lot and it could damage the cylinder, or you may not be getting as much pressure in there as you thought you were because of the temperature. All right, then you have routine maintenance. So one of the things it says is do not allow the cylinder pressure to fall below 50 psi. So in that case, if the cylinder drops below 50 psi, you might have the buildup of moisture in the tank. And now when you refill it, you've got moisture. Even though you have aviator's oxygen, you've introduced moisture to the system and you run into those freezing problems we talked about. And then table 2 here, this talks about the different CFRs. So we have Title 49, 180.209. I'm not sure which title that is, I didn't look it up. But it basically says every 5 years your cylinder has to be hydrostatically tested. So you would want to make sure in the maintenance logs that your cylinder has been tested in the last 5 years and is actually I guess airworthy is the right term here. And then it talks about other things you can do to purge the cylinder or refilling. But make sure you're looking at those maintenance recommendations from the manufacturer before you go messing with these oxygen cylinders. All right, now looking at our other maintenance stuff, our equipment inspection, pressurization systems. So we haven't discussed a lot about pressurization systems. So we focused on a lot of the supplemental oxygen, not pressurization. Pressurization is less common in general aviation. It's less common to run into a pressurized aircraft, especially in a commercial check ride event or a CFI check ride. But they are out there. So let's take the P210, for example. I don't have any experience personally in the P210. I just know of it, and it's kind of one of the more common piston-driven pressurized aircraft that are out there. These pressurization systems are going to be run either from a compressor on the engine, and that could be the same as our vacuum pump. It's going to be something similar to that, or it could work off of excess kind of bleed air, I guess, or pressure that's generated from the turbocharging system. So those are two primary ways our pressurization systems are going to work. The main components of a pressurization system, you're going to have a source of pressure. So again, that's going to come from the turbo or some sort of pump. And then you're going to have a way to manage that pressurization system. And that's going to be through the use of an outflow valve. So you're generally going to have at least two outflow valves. You're going to have a primary and an emergency. So the primary outflow valve is going to have some sort of way to control cabin altitude, usually with a dial that you'll have in the cockpit to set the desired cabin altitude or to set the altitude that you'll be flying at, or both. A lot of times it's lined up there. So let's say you're flying at 15,000 feet, you would set the dial to 15,000 feet, and that would equate to a cabin altitude of 5,000 feet. So in that case, the outflow valve is going to modulate to try to maintain that desired cabin altitude. And if it doesn't, if it starts to overpressurize, then that's when the emergency dump valve or some sort of the secondary regulator valve will open up to keep the airplane from basically exploding. So you always want to have two of those. So your two primary concerns there are an overpressurization where you're on your dump valve, or a loss of pressurization. And usually there's some sort of indicator to let you know, hey, the cabin altitude has dropped below 10,000 feet. And that's going to be the first warning that you get there. All right, so on page 34 of the AC, this is where it talks about your pressure differentials and then your pressure control in turbine aircraft versus piston aircraft. All right, another thing that doesn't get talked about is the fact that if you're in a piston-driven aircraft, you're also going to have pressurized magnetos. And in the P-bearing, for instance, which I do have some time in the P-bearing, the P-bearing actually has pressurized magnetos. So you have a restriction in there. If the pressurized magnetos aren't installed or functioning properly, then you're actually restricted in the altitude you can fly at in that aircraft. And I would assume that it's similar in other piston-driven pressurized aircraft. All right, the AC finishes off talking about our kind of the high altitude emergency stuff. I feel like I've talked for a while now, hour 30. A lot of that was the technical difficulties at the beginning, but I pointed this out. The 61107B, then the other two documents that I've posted on here is our high altitude operation, which is a PDF you can find on the Discord. The airplane upset high altitude operations, it's a supplement for airplane upset recovery training aid that the FAA produces. The O2 brochure, that'll be on there. And then I went ahead and posted a link to the AirOx or SkyOx system so you can see an example of that. And then Oxygen in General Aviation. This was by a Dr. Stanley R. Muller, MD, in 1966. And it actually gives a good breakdown of kind of how oxygen works, physiological or perspective there. So, all right, let me go back here. Ryan 2313, go ahead.
Hey, how's it going? Can you hear me?
Yeah, hear you great.
Hey, Seth, how's it going? Hey, so
Good.
the question I had, follow-up, you answered it last week, but I asked you the question as far as like aiming point, and
Okay.
it wasn't quite the answer I was looking for, but it was still very helpful. It's like, as far as like on a higher density altitude day, flying closer to the runway. But it was about like an aiming point, what you would have. I guess it's just something that I still haven't completely understood as far as like, say your landing point's the 1,000 footers, right? Depending
Right.
on like the atmospheric conditions, wind, density, altitude, things like that. Like where would you aim if your approach speed was like 66?
I generally, this is up, a little bit of a technique on where you're aiming. If it's a really short field, I might aim slightly before my desired touchdown point. But it's also important to point out that, don't confuse your aim point with your touchdown point. So is that something that you're aware of?
Yeah, because I don't know. I've tried looking at like the airplane flying handbook, right, and getting that like sight picture of like aiming, say, at the 500 footers, right? But I feel like it's something that going into CFI, it's still something that for check rides and just obviously as you move up in the ranks, right, the standards get higher and higher. So it's like something that I feel like I still don't fully grasp on where to aim if I wanted to hit 1,000 footers, or could be the numbers, but like the distance before.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, your aim point is going to change. It's one of those kind of art things. Like for me, for instance, I can't always put the plane down exactly where I want it. Like my touchdown point is going to vary depending on conditions and stuff like excess speed, atmospheric conditions, the weight of the aircraft, all of that comes into play. Yeah, all that comes into play. So as long as your aim point isn't shifting on final, that's the main thing that I don't like to see, is if your aim point's shifting. So you can keep that constant aim point until you're in the flare. Yeah, just commit to it. And as long as you're getting relatively close, then that's fine. So you may be holding yourself like too high of a standard where I'm not hitting exactly where I want to every single time. In a smaller aircraft, that's actually doable, but in larger aircraft, you're going to have fluctuations of where your touchdown point is.
Okay, so it's just, again, I guess it's just kind of a feel thing, right? But I guess I just got to go out and just commit to a point and see the results from it, right? And then another random question I had, just kind of off the sidetrack, is like, so flying the 737, how many like memory items do you have in like an emergency situation?
I should probably know this. I think there's like 6. Yeah.
I think the Archer has more.
Yeah. I mean, that's something I thought about covering that as a topic today, but I think there is a little bit of a vein of like overcompensating in GA where we try to, I think there's an intent behind to like overcomplicate certain things, like flying a Cessna 172. We tend to overcomplicate it to make your transition to a more complex aircraft easier. But I think like people like yourself might misunderstood that and think that it scales the same. So I've seen some flight schools that like expect you to memorize the entire emergency, all the emergency procedures. And so they think, oh wow, well I've got to memorize like these 15 procedures. So when I move to a 737, I must have to memorize like 100 because it's much more complex. But it's actually not, because we're using CRM and other things. But you actually don't want to rely on memory items. They're not very good. Our memory is terrible, especially in times of crisis. So you want to narrow down what you're memorizing to the absolute critical items.
Mm-hmm. Well, cool. Anyways, thank you, Seth. Thanks again for all the great content that you provide.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, thanks for talking. All right, we had Matt S., who's a frequent contributor, trusted CFI. He has a good question here. Is there some sort of stigma surrounding declaring an emergency during rapid decompression at the airlines? A friend of mine who's a center controller says it's common occurrence for said scenarios to kind of go like, the airliner says, center request down to 10,000, Roger, descend and maintain 10,000. Are you guys having any issues? Do you need to declare an emergency? And somebody responds, clearly talking through an oxygen mask, nope, no emergency, continuing down to 10,000. And he'd often have to declare the emergency for them. You know, I don't know. I've never had this happen at the airlines. I've never had a rapid decompression. So what might be happening is maybe it's not a rapid decompression, it's just their QRH is driving them to descend. But then also, I know at the airlines we're pretty concerned about that aviate, navigate, communicate deal. So if the QRH says to begin the descent, we're probably handling a lot of other things where we may not get to the declaration of an emergency, especially if it's not critical. Now, if it is a rapid D, yeah, I'm gonna just go ahead and declare and say, hey, look out below, I'm coming down. But I'm not aware of any stigma around that, actually.
Ryan Figgins on YouTube asked if you ever experienced rapid decompression or even explosive decompression, and what was the experience like, and what lessons came from it?
Yeah, no, fortunately I haven't. I've experienced it in the altitude chamber in a controlled environment, but I've never used it or had a real experience of it, thankfully. So. All right, we got a Judson on as a speaker. Yeah, I can hear you. What's going on?
Not much. I'm down in Phoenix, and I'm going to fly up to some higher DA airports, like kind of Flagstaff in that area. And it's getting real hot out here, so we're dealing with, density altitudes up in the 8,000 plus range. I was wondering if you had any general tips beyond just the, use all available runway, lean for best power, hold the brakes, that kind of stuff. My flight school was teaching more of a sort of use a soft short field technique, and I was wondering if that was kind of your preferred method or if you had anything specific you like to do in small planes.
Yeah, definitely, do a full power run up, which is different than what you're normally doing. Lean for best power and then leave the mixture alone once you get that best power, and you want to do it at full power. So make sure you're doing the proper, lean for full power procedure on the ground before you take off. A soft field takeoff might not be a bad idea. It'll get you airborne a little bit earlier, and you can kind of lower the nose and accelerate to build up some excess airspeed, which you're going to need to affect a climb. So rather than like immediately pitch nose high and try to hold that like VX, because the plane's probably just going to sit there and kind of mush, and it's not going to climb, it's not going to accelerate. So yeah, doing that kind of modified soft field and leaving it in ground effect to accelerate, that's especially useful if you're at a field that has, and typically the fields that are higher DA or longer. So if you have like a 13,000 foot runway, you're probably going to be airborne by 4,000 feet. And so you can accelerate. You don't want to accelerate the entire length of the runway, but maybe, especially if there's some sort of markings you can pre-flight, say, hey, I'm going to leave it in ground effect and accelerate through, 3/4 of the way down the runway. Yeah, until the 1,000 footers even. And then I'm going to pitch up for this set airspeed,
Okay. Going along with that, one of the airports I was planning to go to, I've been to before, just when it was cooler out. It's on a slope, the runway. In a light-ish wind at a high DA, would you prefer taking the downhill in a tailwind or the uphill into a headwind?
If it's lightish, it would be downhill with a tailwind. Yeah, your downwind or your downhill, especially if the slope is significant, that's going to be a bigger effect on a calm wind day, much bigger effect even than a little bit of a tailwind. So I would take downhill all the way up to the maximum recommended tailwind component if there was one published. If there's not one published, definitely nothing over 10 knots of a tailwind.
Okay, that's actually a good figure.
Yeah.
That's good to know. All right, thanks, man. I appreciate the podcast. get me through a lot of stuff throughout the day.
Yeah.
Always learning.
All right, awesome. Well, thanks for talking.
Yep. Yeah, buddy. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to have to get off here soon, but I'm going to handle 2 questions on Discord. So first is from Jaeger. He says, is it acceptable practice to use forward slip and emergency descent on a commercial check ride? Yeah, I don't see any problems with that. There might be a problem if, let's say you're in a later Model 172 that suggests that you use flaps. And so if you've got full flaps out and then you start to slip, well, now there's a restriction that says don't slip with flaps, right? So as long as there's no restriction of using the forward slip, then yeah, that's fine. I don't see a problem with it. And then finally, Elias, a good friend of mine. I've actually done a check ride with Elias. We've become friends over the past few months, but he said, hi Seth, not sure if you covered it already, but what are your thoughts on finding places that will actually refill your oxygen tank with aviation approved oxygen? That's a good question. Usually the FBOs will, the bigger FBOs, they'll have access to oxygen. I know here in Arkansas, there's only a couple FBOs, and I would have to actually fly the aircraft to that FBO, get some gas, and then get the oxygen. But they had the ability to serve that. So I would look on ForeFlight for maybe the larger, like a Class C, surface level Class C FBO will generally be able to service your oxygen. And that's something that they can do relatively quickly. If you don't have that at your field, talk to an AMP, because typically especially if it's an aircraft installed on the aircraft, it's going to require a write-up in the logbook that the oxygen was serviced, I believe, because you're going to have to open panels and stuff. Anyway, it's not a bad idea to put it in there. So the maintenance department might do that too. So I actually kind of maybe shot from the hip too much on that. I don't actually know if you have to do the write-up on all aircraft. Some aircraft you do, some aircraft you don't. So don't hold me to that one. But typically a AMP shop, a maintenance shop, or an FBO. All right, well, I hate to jump off here early, but I've got to get some prep done for tomorrow. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you found it useful. I'd love to hear your feedback on kind of the new content or the new outline of the show. Let me know what you think, especially on the Discord community side. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next week. We'll see you.